Your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 15. 2 Samuel chapter 15 as we continue our series in dealing with what do we do with kings. And as we've established, we've been seeing so far in this series, God takes serious the authority that He places in kings and those in authority. We talked about the verses that talk about pray for all those who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life. And that you see in that passage of Scripture as well, the fact that it ties in with giving out the gospel message. Because God is willing that the message of the gospel get out to all. And it's all tied into that passage of Scripture. So we see that the importance of dealing with authorities. So we're going through a series and dealing with what do we do with kings. And to illustrate the importance of God-given authority. We're going to pick up in 2 Samuel chapter 15 in again, probably familiar passage of Scripture and dealing with Absalom, David's son. And what we need to look at is what do we do with kings when one defies God's man? You know, we know that God has put David into the throne. We know that God ordained David as a young, more likely teenager, says you're going to take the throne. Now, he didn't take the throne until probably 38, 40 years later, in which he took the throne. But we know that that was God's intention. Well, now we're going to sit in the situation, well, what do you do when somebody goes and defies God's man? What do we do? Well, let's look in verse 1. It says, "And it came to pass after this that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate, and was so that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, Of what city art thou? And he said, Thy servant is of one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there's no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Absalom said moreover, O that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath a suit or cause might come unto me, that I would do him justice. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. And on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel." Let's paint a picture here, because I think those of us who've been in church most of our lives, and some of us all our lives, have heard the story. But a lot of times we hear a story, we have certain things that are in our mind, and we kind of just skim through it. And I want us to really look at this, because here's the situation. David is the king. God has appointed him to be the king. Absalom, his son, has come, and as we know, the end result, he steals the kingdom. He becomes the king. So what do we do when someone defies God's man? Well, I think the important thing here as we go through this is we've got to understand a few things. We need to understand something about the person who decided that it was okay to go against God's man and take that authority. We need to understand some things. Now, let's look at verse 2 and some things about Absalom. It says, "And Absalom rose up early." Absalom knew that he needed to get in there where he needed to do, and he needed to do it early. Meaning, the way the government was set up back in those days is you would come to the gate of the city, or you would come to the gate of where the leader was, and all the government work was done there. Well, Absalom got there first. Now, when you're going to overthrow the authorities, then you're going to have to position yourself in a place in which people, when they show up and they see you there, they're going to assume some things. They're going to assume that you have some authority. Why else would you be standing there? And they would sit there and say, oh, he's the first one I saw. Maybe someone says, you know what, I need to get to the king. I've got an issue and I need to present this. And boy, it's going to be a long line. So I'm going to get there first. So I'm going to get there early. I'm going to get in line early because I really want this to be taken care of. So they get there early in the morning, and sure enough, hey, someone's already here. This is great. Absalom knew that if he was going to undermine the authority, he was going to have to put him in a position where people would think he is the person they're supposed to be seeing. So he rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. Not only did he get there early, but the implication here of this next phrase was he actually was out a little ways from the gate. He was not right there at the spot where the business was supposed to take care of, but he was a little bit out there beyond the gate. So when as the people came, he's not only going to be the first one they see, they're not going to then see the others. He's coming out, and if you will, he's coming to them and say, hey, look, I know it would be a longer trip for you to come all the way here where we're supposed to be, so I'm going to come out there, and I'm going to meet you where you're at. We see something about Absalom. He knows I've got to get to the people first, and I've got to keep them away from those people who are the actual authorities. Now, I say this because I want us to paint a picture here that's going to kind of relate to us today. In dealing with authority, if we're going to do what is right as a people, and we're going to see this later on in this message and the one to come, if we're going to deal with those in authority and we're going to do what is right, we've got to have our eyes open, because there are going to be those who are going to try to usurp the authority of those over us, and if we're not paying attention, we're going to get ourselves wrapped up into something we never intended to do. We're going to get ourselves following somebody and following their leadership because we're going to assume that they're right and they're supposed to be there. So what should have happened, and we're going to see this later on, what should have happened is those people would say, wait a minute, Absalom, I know who you are, I know you're the king's son, but this isn't the way it's supposed to be done. Why are you here early, and why are you so far out here? Why are we not where we're supposed to be? But we find that that's not the question that was being asked. So we see that he comes and he puts himself in a position where when the people come and when they see him, they simply respond to him when he asks him, now, where are you from? He follows the steps and procedures that what you're supposed to do to hear a matter. And so he does, he asks these, and these people just simply reply, well, I'm from here, and this is what's happening. Notice in verse 3, the next thing Absalom does, he responds to him and says, thy matters are good and right. He's like, man, you know what? You're right. Boy, you got this problem. You're right. Now, normally what is happening here is someone's coming to the king because there's a grievance or there's a difficulty or there's a problem. It could be anything from, so-and-so neighbor has, their cattle or their sheep are getting over into our property, or so-and-so is coming in and they're using our well instead of theirs, and, just different things. And so they're coming and saying, look, I need some help with this. Now, a good judge is going to sit there and say, okay, let me hear what you're saying, and now let's go look and investigate and find out, is this actually happening, get the truth. Absalom immediately says, you're right. Absalom immediately tells these people, you know what, you're right. It doesn't matter. I don't need to investigate anything. I don't need to go look at anything. You're right. Now, if you're going to usurp the authority of somebody, you got to be able to get out in front of them. You got to get to where they're not going to actually get to those in authority. And you got to sit there and say, you know what, these people, you're going to make them think, hey, this guy pays attention to me. He cares about me, because you're going to tell them they're right. Notice what is happening here, what Absalom is doing. And then he said to them, you know what, you're right. There's no need for you to go any further, because the king's not really going to help you. I'm just going to tell you right now, the king could care less. Your problems are so minuscule to him, he doesn't care. He begins to paint a picture to the people that's saying, you know what, I agree with you, you're right. But if I take this to the king, I'm telling you what his answer is going to be. Why are they bothering me with such trivial things? He begins to put a doubt in their minds as that the authority is going to do anything about their problems. And then notice what he says in verse 4. Absalom said, moreover, oh, that I were made judge in the land. Boy, I tell you what, if I was the one making the final decision. And it's interesting that he used here, oh, that I were made judge in the land. He doesn't use the word for king here. He uses the word for judge. This, I believe, and studying this, I believe is very significant. Because I think there are still a generation of people, and possibly a generation of children afterwards, that grew up in a home in which their parents and their grandparents were saying, man, we had it so much better back in the day of the judges. Boy, I know we asked for kings, but boy, did we make a mistake. Ever since we've had kings, we had Saul coming in, and he just was a madman. Now, David has come in, and it seems that all we're doing is fighting wars. I mean, all we're doing is in battle against this country and this people. I mean, it's just, boy, it was so much better back in the days of the judges. So Absalom's saying, boy, I tell you what, if you make me the judge, we won't have all this stuff. All this stuff that's going on. And he begins to paint a picture to the people of something that is not the way God had set it up. He's trying to make it look like, hey, well, let's go back to the good old days. Well, let's talk a second about the good old days. The good old days that he's referring to were the days in which God would bless his people. The people would then sit there and say, God, I appreciate you getting us out of this trouble, but we're good now. We can live our lives without you. And they'd find themselves again going away from God, God bringing judgment on them. And the only reason why God brought a judge in was after the people repented and saying, boy, did we mess up, God, we've got to have you. So he's painting a picture, and the people are thinking of some ideological world that was back then. But in order for a judge to be put in place, the people at that point would have had to have remembered, hey, wait a minute, we've done wrong. But he just told them, you know what, you're right. You're good people. Everything's wonderful. You're right. What you think has been going against you, that's a good thing. So Absalom here is painting a picture to people who are not paying attention to what is true. And Absalom comes in there. And in verse 6, at the end of verse 6, we see, and so Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Absalom comes in, and everybody in the country is going, man, that Absalom guy, man, he's a good guy. Boy, I tell you what, he understands where we're coming from. He understands what life's all about. And he has got to the point where the people are responding to him. Let's ask a few questions here. Does Absalom have their best interests in mind? No. Because Absalom throughout this whole thing has lied to them. Absalom throughout this whole thing has allowed them to paint a picture of what is going on and making them think, hey, we're okay, everything's right, this is the way it's supposed to be done. And so what is happening here, unfortunately, is something that happens even today in situations, and I'm going to relate this now back to the church, in which the people in the church feel like everything's fine, everything's the way it's supposed to be. This is how church is supposed to be being done. They stand with confidence, saying, hey, we're fine. This is right. This is how you're supposed to run church. This is how things are supposed to be done. And you know what? I like what this guy's saying. Because you know what? Sometimes that pastor, he's a dictator. He wants things done his way, and he's not really paying attention to our grievances and our problems. Maybe we should really be listening to this other person. They really do understand what's going on. And what happens is we then all of a sudden have a church that has a major issues and blow-ups in which we have experienced, we've seen in our lives, and we said, how is this happening? What's going on? And it all comes down to this. What do we do with kings? When one defies God's man, well, one, we've got to be able to identify what is happening. And realize we've got wrapped up in our own little lives instead of stopping long enough to say, you know what? what does God say how we're supposed to be responding to this? What are we supposed to be doing when someone sits there and says, hey, the authority over you, they're wrong, they don't care about you? What should our response be? Well, we're going to get to it as we come to the end of the series, but let me just throw in here. God tells us that we're to pray for all those that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life with all godly and honesty. Because the whole point is to be able to get that message of the gospel out. So our response should be, we got to do what God tells us to do. And as long as God's got this man as our authority, as long as God says, this is my king, we just need to submit to that authority and lead a quiet and peaceful life, because we've got a message of a gospel that's got to get out. We've already seen in one of the previous messages, if the king does wrong, what do we do? David's mighty men, Uriah, still did what was right, in spite of the fact that David did what was wrong. What do we do? Well, we come back here to Absalom, and we see that Absalom is there because he wants to take control. So, verse 10 says, Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as ye hear the sound of the trumpet, then ye shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. Here's what Absalom does. He goes out to where all the people are and says, now look, here's what's going to happen. Be prepared, because I'm getting ready to take over. And as much as it just grieves me to say this, I continue to see this happening in churches. You have people that are undermining the authority of the pastor, and they're out there saying, just wait. When this happens, be prepared, because we're going to take over. So Absalom sends out these people and prepares them. Verse 12, and Absalom sent Ahithophel, David's counselor, from his city, while he offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. We see that Absalom puts everything in place, and that everybody is buying into this idea that David is not the man that God placed in the kingdom for us. That Absalom's the person, and this is the way we should go. So what do we do with kings? When a man takes over that's not called by God. Well, some of you would think, oh, I'll tell you what we're going to do. Boy, we've got this down. We're not going to do what Absalom wants to do. We got to be careful, because we've got to do something that is contrary to what we think we ought to be doing. And here's this, verse 13. And there came a messenger to David, saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. David now knows what's getting ready to take place. David now knows that the people have turned against him as king and turned toward Absalom. So what does David do? David, in verse 14, and David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee. Now I want to be careful here, because I'm going to sound almost as if I'm contradicting myself, and sometimes even the Bible appears to be doing that, but we're going to be able to tie this in. Because at this point, someone say, well, yep, Absalom's taken over, so you just back off. Again, relating back to the churches. I've been in the ministry a long time and advised a lot of pastors, a lot of preachers that have been in a similar situation. More times than not, advise them to sit there and say, you know what, you need to stand for what is right. Don't allow Satan to get a victory here. And some may look at that and say, yep, that's right, I'm going to stand my ground. But then I'm going to give some advice here, and I'm going to say, you know what, you need to step back. Now, isn't that the opposite side? No, because here's the thing. We need to step back and let God deal with it. Now, how do we let God deal with it? Well, one of the things, and we're going to see later on, one of the things we got to do is we've got to confront with the truth. The pastors are not sit there and say, well, hey, the people are rebelling against my authority, I'm just going to leave. No, you got to present them with the truth. But you know what? You got to let God do the work. One of the things we've already brought up in this series is, what do you do with the king? What did David do with Saul? Saul was his authority, but Saul was as wicked as they come. David says, that's not my business. It's God's business. David's response is the exact same thing here. David is now the authority. What do you do when somebody rebels against that authority? You know what? It's not my job to make sure I stay in authority, because my authority is only based upon God given to me. So it is not my responsibility to sit there and hold on to something. I need to step back and let God deal with it. So David just simply, some will say, well, David just gave up and ran away. No, David had the exact same response to Absalom as he did with Saul. This is God's business, not mine. I'm going to let God deal with it. Now, in the practical sense here, David realized in order for God to deal with this, I'm going to have to step back. I'm going to have to step back and protect myself and those who are following me. Because if we stay right here and God's judgment falls on all who are there. So David understood enough saying, look, we're going to step back. And we're going to allow God to bring the judgment. We're going to allow God to work, but I'm going to have to step back. So we know the situation here. David then steps back. He said, arise, let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtakes us suddenly, and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. David's concern was God's place, and David's concern was God's people. And he said, if we stay here and try to fight this battle ourselves, then there's going to be a problem. David says, look, we're just going to need to step back. God's got a plan. God's going to deal with this. Verse 15, and the king's servant said unto the king, behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint. And the king went forth, and all his household after him. They were saying, we'll do whatever you want us to do. And David said, okay, here's what I want. We're going to step back. Sometimes we have to just remember, God's placed his authority over us. And if we're going to submit to that authority, then we need to submit to that authority. And sometimes the authority may say, look, here's what we need to do. We need to step back. They could have said, no, king, no, you're making a wrong choice. We need to fight. We'll fight for you. You need to fight. How is that submitting to authority when we are just now, if we responded that way, if David's people that was there in Jerusalem responded the same way, there would be no difference between them and Absalom. No, you're doing the wrong thing. This is what we do. We're behind you, king. Don't misunderstand us. We're behind you 100%. We think you're wrong, so here's what you need to do. You see the picture here. There has to be a point in which we can distinguish between those who are going to sit there and say, you know what, this is God's authority. This is God's king. We're going to do whatever you ask us to do. The picture that we're painting here is, what do we do with kings when one defies God's man? The answer is, we just simply say, God, you're in control. We're going to follow you, and as long as this is your authority, we're going to respond to you. We're going to give you the understanding you know what you're doing, and we may not. So here we see David is now going to leave. He's going to depart. And those that would follow David went with him. But there were some that stayed. Again, what do we do with kings? When someone defies God's man, we simply still submit ourselves to authority. But we've got to start paying attention so that we can distinguish between the two. Who is truly following the authorities, and who is opposed to them. At this point in this story, they're almost hard to distinguish between the two. When we don't understand the picture and we don't understand what's going on, we almost get to the point where I can't tell the difference. Because there's now an entire nation who wants to follow Absalom, who believes that they are following what is right, because they didn't take the time to earlier understand who it was that they were truly following. Our submission to authority is ultimately our submission to God. And if we are submitting to God, God is not going to be silent in communicating to us who His God-given authorities are. So if we get confused as to who to follow, it's because we either didn't ask or we didn't listen to the answer. Right now, the nation is divided, and no one seems to know who to follow. And no one seems to know what is right. They just know that, boy, Absalom, man, you just seem to be the one with all the answers. David, you're running? And what happens is if we don't understand what God's trying to teach and understand the biblical principle of God-given authority, we're going to find ourselves in the middle of a chaos and going, I don't know what to do. Sounds to me way too much like the church today. What do we do with kings?